Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into Immanuel Kant's critique of practical reason.
Mm,
It's a book that's had a pretty huge impact on how we think about morality. And I'm
yeah.
really excited to unpack some of its key ideas.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating work. In his critique of pure reason, Kant explored, how we understand the world through our senses and our intellect. But in the critique of practical reason, he kind of shifts his focus. He wants to understand the role of reason in guiding our actions and moral choices.
So it's less about what we know and more about what we do.
Exactly. Kant is really setting out to examine what he calls pure practical reason. That is, reason's capacity to determine our will independently of our desires and inclinations.
Okay, so before we get too deep into the Kantian weeds here, can you give our listener just a quick roadmap of the book? Like, what's the overall argument and how does it unfold?
Sure. So Kant starts by distinguishing between uh, subjective principles, which he calls maxims, and objective principles, which are universal moral laws. So maxims are kind of like personal rules of thumb. They guide your actions based on your desires and
So
circumstances.
it's something like, always be polite to your elders would be a maxim.
Precisely. But for Kant, morality can't be based on these subjective whims. He argues that true moral principles must be grounded in reason and apply universally to all rational beings. And these universal principles are what he calls categorical imperatives, commands of reason that hold unconditionally.
Ah, yes, the categorical imperative. That's one of Kant's most famous ideas.
It is, and he gives us several formulations of it, but perhaps the most well-known is act only according to that maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law.
So before we act, we should kind of ask ourselves, would we want everyone to act the same way?
Exactly. It's a test of universalizability. Kant argues that if a maxim can't be universalized without contradiction, then the action it leads to is immoral.
Mm,
So, for example, lying can't be universalized, because if everyone lied, trust would collapse, and lying itself would become impossible.
that makes sense. So morality for Kant is about acting in a way that's consistent with these universal principles of reason.
Right, and this leads him to a really fascinating discussion of freedom. Kant argues that we are aware of our freedom precisely because we experience the moral law as binding on us.
Hmm.
We feel obligated to do what's right even when we don't want to. And this sense of obligation reveals our capacity to choose freely.
So for Kant, freedom isn't about doing whatever we want, but about acting in accordance with our rational nature.
Exactly. He even has this thought experiment where he imagines a man who is overcome with lust. And he asks, would this man still find his desire irresistible if he knew he'd be hanged immediately after satisfying it?
I'm guessing he would suddenly find a way to control himself.
Exactly. This for Kant shows that ought implies can. If we feel a moral obligation to do something, we must also be capable of doing it.
Hmm.
And this capacity to act against our inclinations is the essence of freedom for Kant.
Wow, that's a powerful idea. It makes you wonder if our struggles with temptation are actually signs of our own freedom. Where does happiness fit into all of this? Kant seems pretty focused on duty and moral law.
That's a great question. And it leads us to another key concept, the summum bonum, or the highest good. Kant defines this as the combination of virtue and happiness. And he says we strive for both. But the world doesn't always reward virtue with happiness.
You mean good people don't always get what they deserve?
Right. This apparent conflict is what Kant calls the antinomy of practical reason. It seems like the world should be morally ordered, with happiness following virtue. But our experience often suggests otherwise.
So how does he resolve this?
He offers a more nuanced solution. Kant argues that while the connection between virtue and happiness might not be fully realized in this world, it's a necessary postulate for practical reason. We need to believe that the highest good is achievable even if we don't see it happening all the time.
So we kind of have to have faith that things will ultimately work out.
In a way, yes. And this is where Kant's idea of what he calls rational faith comes in. He suggests that although we can't definitively prove God's existence through pure reason, we're justified in believing in God based on the demands of practical reason.
Wait, so Kant is making a case for believing in God? I thought he was all about logic and reason.
He is. But for Kant, reason isn't limited to what we can empirically observe or logically deduce. He recognizes that there are certain beliefs that we need in order to make sense of our moral experience and to live a truly moral life.
Okay, now things are getting really interesting. You're telling me that for Kant, faith isn't about blind acceptance, but about a kind of rational necessity.
Exactly. He famously writes in the Critique, I have therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. It's a really provocative statement, And it goes to the heart of his project in The Critique of Practical Reason. He's trying to show that morality and faith are not opposed to reason, but rather deeply intertwined with it.
This is blowing my mind a little bit. I'm starting to see why Kant is considered such a giant in philosophy.
He really is, and we've only just begun to explore the depths of his thought. But before we move on, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, duty. Where does that fit into Kant's moral framework?
Yeah, that's a great question. From what I understand, duty plays a really central role. He seems to be saying that acting morally isn't about following our desires or pursuing happiness, but about doing what's right simply because it's our duty.
You're absolutely right. For Kant, duty is the necessity of acting out of reverence for the moral law.
Okay.
It's about recognizing the objective validity of moral principles and choosing to act in accordance with them, even when it's difficult or goes against our personal inclinations.
So it's not about what we want to do, but about what we ought to do, based on the dictates of reason.
Precisely. Kant makes a really clear distinction between actions that are merely in accordance with duty and those done from duty. It's only actions motivated by duty itself that hold genuine moral worth. So let me give you an example. Imagine you see someone struggling and you decide to help them. Now, you might be motivated by compassion, or maybe you enjoy the feeling of being helpful. Those are all fine reasons. But for Kant, they wouldn't make the action truly moral.
Because motivation is coming from feelings rather than duty to the moral law.
Exactly. Now imagine you help that same person even though you're having a bad day, and you don't particularly feel like it. You do it purely because you recognize it's the right thing to do. It's your duty. That, for Kant, demonstrates true moral worth.
So even if it's inconvenient or doesn't make us feel good, we should act according to our duty to the moral law.
That's the core of Kantian ethics. He even goes so far as to say that the only thing good without qualification is a good will, a will that chooses to act from duty, regardless of the consequences.
Okay, I get that duty's important, but this feels kind of extreme. Does this mean our emotions and desires have no place in morality?
It's not that we should suppress our emotions entirely. Kant recognizes that we are complex beings with both a rational and a sensible nature. However, he argues that reason must have the final say when it comes to moral decisions.
So it's about finding a balance, but ultimately letting reason be our guide.
Precisely. Now, this leads us to another important aspect of Kant's ethics, the different types of imperatives. We've already discussed categorical imperatives, which are those unconditional commands of reason. But Kant also identifies what he calls hypothetical imperatives.
What are those?
Hypothetical imperatives are conditional commands. They tell us what to do if we want to achieve a specific goal. For example, if you want to get a good grade, you should study hard. This only applies if you actually want that good grade.
So categorical imperatives tell us what we must do, while hypothetical imperatives are more like guidelines for achieving certain outcomes.
That's a great way to put it. Hypothetical imperatives are about prudence and skill, guiding us towards desired ends. But they don't hold the same moral weight as categorical imperatives, which stem from the universal and unconditional moral law.
Okay, that makes sense. But this all sounds pretty theoretical. How do these ideas actually play out in our everyday lives? Can you give our listeners some concrete examples of how we can apply Kant's philosophy to the real world?
Absolutely. One key takeaway from Kant is the importance of treating all people as ends in themselves, not merely as means to an end.
So basically, don't use or exploit people for your own benefit.
Precisely. This principle of respect for persons is fundamental to Kantian ethics. It means recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of every individual, regardless of their social status, their abilities, or how useful they might be to us.
That resonates with me. It implies that we should always consider the impact of our actions on others and strive to treat everyone fairly and compassionately.
Exactly. Another key takeaway is Kant's emphasis on universalizability. Before acting, we should ask ourselves, what if everyone did this? This helps us evaluate the ethical implications of our choices, especially when we're tempted to make exceptions for ourselves or those we care about.
Right, like that idea of willing our actions to become universal laws. It forces us to think beyond our own immediate desires and consider the broader consequences.
Exactly. And finally, Kant's focus on duty reminds us that doing the right thing isn't always easy or fun. Sometimes it requires us to act against our inclinations, even when it involves personal sacrifice or discomfort.
It's about choosing to do what's right simply because it's right, even when it's hard. It sounds like Kant is calling for a certain level of moral courage.
He is. His ethics challenge us to prioritize duty over personal gain or comfort, and to act from principle even when it's difficult. Of course, Kant's philosophy isn't without its critics. Some find his emphasis on duty too rigid, and say it doesn't allow enough room for compassion, empathy, or other emotions. Others question whether universalizability is always a reliable guide for making moral decisions.
It sounds like his work has sparked a lot of debate and discussion, which is a testament to its influence.
It certainly has. And even if we don't agree with all his conclusions, Kant's work provides an incredibly valuable framework for thinking about ethics and the nature of moral obligation.
It's a deep dive that really makes us examine our own moral principles and strive to act in a way that aligns with reason.
Absolutely. And now, as we wrap up our exploration of the critique of practical reason, let's revisit that crucial link between Kant's practical philosophy and the idea of God.
Yes, we talked about the summum bonum and the postulate of God's existence, but I'd love to delve a bit deeper into how those ideas connect to the overall argument of the book.
Of course, as we've seen, Kant argues that pure practical reason leads us to the moral law, which in turn compels us to strive for the highest good, the combination of virtue and happiness. But he recognizes a potential problem here.
Because the world doesn't always reward virtue with happiness. Sometimes bad things happen to good people and vice versa.
Exactly. And this apparent disconnect between morality and happiness creates a kind of tension or paradox within practical reason. Kant calls this the antinomy of practical reason.
So how does he resolve this antinomy? Does he just say we have to live with the fact that life isn't always fair?
Not quite. Kant suggests that while the connection between virtue and happiness might not be perfectly realized in the sensible world, it's a necessary presupposition for practical reason. We need to believe that the highest good is achievable even if we don't always see it in our everyday experience.
So it's a matter of faith.
In a way, yes, but not blind faith. Kant calls it rational faith, a belief that stems from the demands of practical reason rather than from theoretical knowledge.
Okay, but how does God fit into all of this?
Remember, Kant argues that pure practical reason leads us to the moral law. This moral law demands that we strive for the highest good. But if the universe were purely mechanistic, governed only by the laws of nature, there would be no guarantee that virtue would ultimately be rewarded with happiness.
Because in a purely material world, morality wouldn't necessarily have any real power or influence.
Exactly. To make sense of this demand for the highest good, we need to postulate the existence of a God who ensures that the moral order of the universe ultimately aligns with our striving for virtue and happiness.
So God acts as a kind of guarantor of ultimate justice, ensuring that things ultimately work out as they should, morally speaking.
Precisely. Now, it's important to emphasize that Kant is not trying to prove God's existence in a traditional theological sense.
He's not offering a cosmological argument or trying to prove God's existence through reason alone.
Exactly. Instead, he's arguing that belief in God is a practical necessity for moral agents. He calls it a postulate of practical reason.
It's not about theoretical proof, but about recognizing that we need this belief in God in order to make sense of our moral obligations and to have a reason to strive for the highest good.
That's the heart of Kant's argument without the idea of God. The moral law would ultimately be meaningless. We would be striving for a goal that would be impossible to achieve in a purely mechanistic universe.
So Kant is saying that morality and faith are fundamentally intertwined.
Exactly. For Kant reason, morality and faith all work together to support and inform each other. This is one of the most revolutionary aspects of his philosophy, and it's had a profound impact on how we understand the relationship between these concepts.
I can see why it opens up a whole new way of thinking about faith, not as something opposed to reason, but as something deeply connected to it. And this raises a question for me and maybe for you, listener, as well.
Yeah.
How do we reconcile this idea of rational faith with the fact that there's so much suffering and injustice in the world? If God is the guarantor of moral order, why do bad things happen to good people?
That's an excellent question, and it's one that philosophers and theologians have been grappling with for centuries. Kant himself doesn't shy away from this problem. He acknowledges that the world often appears to be unjust, that virtue isn't always rewarded, and that suffering seems randomly distributed.
So how does he deal with this apparent contradiction? Does he just say, we have to have blind faith that God has a plan we can't understand?
He offers a more nuanced perspective. Kant distinguishes between the sensible world, which is the world we experience through our senses, and the intelligible world, which is the realm of reason and moral law. He suggests that the connection between virtue and happiness might not be fully realized in the sensible world, but it is guaranteed in the intelligible world.
So even though we don't always see justice prevailing in the world around us, we can have faith that it ultimately exists on a deeper, more fundamental level.
Exactly. And this faith for Kant isn't about ignoring the reality of suffering or injustice. It's about holding on to the belief that ultimately the moral order of the universe will prevail.
It's a matter of trusting that despite appearances, There is a deeper meaning and purpose to our moral striving.
Precisely, and this brings us to another important aspect of Kant's moral philosophy, the concept of autonomy.
Autonomy, what does that mean in this context?
For Kant, autonomy is the opposite of heteronomy. Heteronomy means being ruled by something outside of oneself, whether it's our desires, social pressures, or even divine commands. Autonomy, on the other hand, is the capacity to give oneself the moral law.
So it's not about following rules imposed from the outside, but about choosing to act in accordance with principles we recognize as rationally valid.
Exactly. Kant argues that true morality must be grounded in autonomy. We are only truly free when we act from a sense of duty to the moral law that we ourselves have recognized as rationally binding.
It's a powerful idea.
Yeah.
It suggests that true moral responsibility requires us to think for ourselves and to choose our actions based on our own understanding of what is right.
Precisely, and this emphasis on autonomy has had a profound impact on how we think about ethics and moral decision-making. It challenges us to move beyond blind obedience to external authorities and to develop our own moral compass based on reason and reflection.
This is all incredibly insightful. I'm starting to see how Kant's ideas can help us navigate the complexities of moral life and make choices that align with our deepest values.
It certainly is a rich and challenging philosophy, and I think one of the most valuable aspects of the critique of practical reason is that it invites us to engage in this kind of deep thinking about our own moral beliefs and motivations.
It's a call to live a life guided by reason, duty, and a belief in the ultimate goodness of the universe.
Exactly. And now, as we approach the end of our exploration, let's consider what might be one of the most enduring legacies of Kant's thought, the idea of the kingdom of ends.
The kingdom of ends, I don't think we've talked about that yet. What is it?
It's one of Kant's most inspiring and thought-provoking concepts. He describes it as a hypothetical ideal, a community of rational beings who all act in accordance with the moral law and treat each other as ends in themselves.
So it's a vision of a world where everyone acts morally and respects the dignity of every other person.
Exactly. In the kingdom of ends, there is no exploitation, no manipulation, and no coercion. Everyone acts from a sense of duty, and everyone recognizes the inherent worth of every other member of the community.
It sounds like a utopian ideal.
It is in many ways, but for Kant, it's not just a fantasy. He sees it as a regulative ideal, something we should strive towards even though we may never fully achieve it.
So it's like a guiding principle for how we should interact with each other and build a more just and ethical society.
Precisely. The kingdom of ends serves as a reminder that our moral actions have implications beyond our own individual lives. They contribute to the creation of a world where reason and morality prevail, a world where everyone is treated with respect and dignity.
It's a beautiful and inspiring vision, and it seems particularly relevant today as we face so many challenges that require us to work together and find common ground.
It certainly does. Kant's philosophy reminds us that even in the face of conflict and division, we have a shared capacity for reason and a shared responsibility to create a world worthy of our moral aspirations.
This has been an incredible journey through Kant's critique of practical reason. We've covered so much ground, from the foundations of moral law to the concept of rational faith, from the importance of duty to the vision of the kingdom of ends. It's amazing how much depth and richness there is to explore in this one book.
It's a testament to Kant's genius and the enduring power of his ideas.
But before we wrap things up, I want to bring our listener back to a question we touched on earlier. If we can't definitively know about this supersensible realm, the realm of reason and moral law, does that diminish the force of the moral law, or does its practical necessities stand firm regardless?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's one that each of us has to grapple with for ourselves. Kant seems to suggest that the moral law's authority stems from its own inherent rationality, its universality, and its undeniable claim on our conscience.
So even if we can't fully comprehend the ultimate source of morality, its power to guide our actions remains intact.
Precisely, and perhaps that's one of the most profound and enduring insights of Kant's critique of practical reason.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the critique of practical reason. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration of Kant's thought-provoking and influential work. We hope you found it as engaging and insightful as we did, and as always, we encourage you to continue exploring these ideas on your own.
Until next time, happy reading!